The moment I walked through the automatic doors of Mercy General Hospital carrying a bouquet of yellow roses, Linda's favorite, I knew something was terribly wrong. The receptionist's confused expression when I asked for Nurse Linda Richardson should have been my first clue, but I was still naive enough to believe that 18 years of marriage meant I actually knew my wife. "I'm sorry, sir," the young woman behind the desk said, checking her computer screen twice. "We don't have a Linda Richardson on staff. Are you sure you have the right hospital?" My heart started racing. This was definitely the right hospital. The same Mercy General where Linda had worked for the past 8 years, where she pulled double shifts and weekend emergencies, where she'd built her entire nursing career while I supported our family working at Morrison Auto Parts. "Maybe she's in a different department," I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. "Linda Richardson, she's been working here since 2017. Brown hair, about 5'6", works mostly night shifts in the cardiac unit." The receptionist's expression shifted from confusion to something that looked like pity. "Sir, I've been working here for 3 years and I know all our nursing staff. We've never had anyone by that name." I stood there holding those yellow roses, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath my feet, while the truth began to creep into my consciousness like poison. "My name is Thomas Richardson, but everyone calls me Tom. I'm 54 years old, a veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom, and for the past 18 years, I thought I'd been living a pretty ordinary life in Millbrook, Ohio. I work as a supervisor at Morrison Auto Parts. Same job I've had since I came back from Iraq in 2005. I married Linda 2 years later, and we've been raising 2 kids together, Jake, who's 16, and Sophie, who just turned 13. Linda has always been the strong one in our relationship, the organized one, the one who kept our family running smoothly while working a demanding job as a registered nurse. At least, that's what I thought she was doing. I'd come to the hospital that Thursday afternoon because it was our wedding anniversary, 18 years. And Linda had mentioned she was working a double shift and wouldn't be home until late. I wanted to surprise her, maybe take her to dinner after her shift, show her that I remembered our special day, even though she'd been so busy with work lately that we barely saw each other anymore. Lately was actually an understatement. Over the past few years, Linda had been working more and more hours. Night shifts, weekend emergencies, mandatory overtime, medical conferences in other cities. She'd leave Thursday morning and sometimes not come home until Monday evening, exhausted and stressed, apologizing for being absent, but explaining that the hospital was short-staffed and she couldn't let her patients down. I'd been proud of her dedication. In a world where people complained about their jobs, my wife was saving lives, making a difference, sacrificing her comfort for the greater good. When she missed Jake's baseball games or Sophie's school plays, I made excuses for her, told the kids that Mum was helping sick people, that her work was important. I never questioned why she was never available when I called the hospital looking for her. She always had explanations. She was in surgery, or in a patient's room where phones weren't allowed, or covering for another nurse in a different department. The few times I'd tried to visit her at work before, she'd told me that hospital policy prohibited family visits during shifts, that it was unprofessional and distracting. But standing in that lobby, holding wilted flowers and staring at a computer screen that showed no record of my wife ever working there, I realized that 18 years of trust had been built on 18 years of lies. "Could you check under her maiden name?" I asked desperately. "Linda Patterson?" The receptionist searched again, shaking her head. "I'm sorry, sir, no Linda Patterson either." I walked back to my truck in a daze, my mind racing through every conversation, every excuse, every time Linda had left for work and I'd kissed her goodbye, believing she was going to help sick people when she was actually going. Where? That evening, when Linda came home at her usual time, around 10 p.m., I was waiting in the living room with 1,000 questions and no idea how to ask them. "Hey, honey," she said, dropping her purse by the door and stretching like she'd had a long day. "Sorry I'm so late. We had 3 cardiac arrests come in during my shift and I couldn't leave until everything was stabilized." She looked tired, like she always did after work, but now I was studying her face for signs of deception instead of admiring her dedication. "How was the cardiac unit today?" I asked carefully. "Exhausting," she replied, walking to the kitchen to get a glass of water. "We're still short 2 nurses, so everyone's pulling double duty. I barely had time for lunch. Every word felt like a needle under my skin. If she wasn't working at Mercy General, where had she been for the past 12 hours? Who were these cardiac patients she was talking about? What double duty was she pulling, and for whom? Tom? Linda was looking at me strangely. You look pale. Are you feeling okay? I'm fine, I said, though I felt anything but fine. Just tired. That night, lying in bed next to my wife of 18 years, I stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of what I'd discovered. There had to be an explanation. Maybe Linda worked for a different hospital and had lied about which one to avoid some kind of workplace policy issue. Maybe she was working for a private nursing agency that contracted with multiple facilities. Maybe she was involved in some kind of medical research that required confidentiality. But deep down, I knew none of those explanations made sense. You don't lie to your husband about where you work for 8 years because of hospital policy. You don't create an elaborate fiction about double shifts and cardiac arrests for research purposes. The next morning, after Linda left for another shift, I called in sick to work and drove to every hospital, clinic, and medical facility within 50 miles of our house. I asked for Linda Richardson, Linda Patterson, even described her to staff members who might know her by sight. Nothing. No one had ever heard of my wife. I came home that afternoon and sat in my kitchen, looking around at the life we'd built together, the photos on the refrigerator, the kids' school schedules held up with magnets, the grocery lists in Linda's handwriting, and realized I didn't know anything about the woman I'd been married to for 18 years. That's when I decided to follow her. The next Thursday morning, I told Linda I was going to work early, but instead parked down the street and waited. At 7:30 a.m., she came out of our house in her scrubs, carrying her nursing bag, looking like she was heading off to save lives. She got in her car and drove east, toward what I thought would be Mercy General. But instead, she got on Highway 23, heading north toward Columbus. I followed her for 2 hours, staying far enough behind that she wouldn't notice me, until she pulled into the driveway of a large colonial house in an upscale suburb I'd never seen before. She used a key to let herself in, like she belonged there. I parked across the street and watched my wife disappear into another life. For 3 hours, I sat in my truck, trying to understand what I was seeing. Maybe Linda was caring for an elderly patient, doing private duty nursing for someone who needed round-the-clock care. That would explain the long hours, the overnight stays, even the secrecy if the family wanted privacy. But then the front door opened, and Linda came out with 2 small children, a boy who looked about 7 years old and a girl who couldn't have been more than 5. They were laughing and holding her hands, calling her Mama as she walked them to a minivan parked in the driveway. I watched my wife, load 2 children I'd never seen before into a car I didn't know she owned and drive away like this was the most normal thing in the world. That's when I understood that Linda didn't just work somewhere else. She lived somewhere else. She was someone else's wife, someone else's mother, someone else's entire life. I drove home in shock, called in sick to work again, and spent the rest of the day trying to process what I'd witnessed. My wife had another family, children who called her Mama, a house where she had her own key, a completely separate existence that had nothing to do with me or Jake or Sophie. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal. It was the realization of how elaborate her deception had been. Every night shift, every weekend emergency, every medical conference in another city, every time she'd kiss me goodbye and promise to be careful driving to work, every time she'd come home exhausted and told me about difficult patients or hospital politics. All of it had been lies, carefully crafted stories to hide the fact that she was living an entirely different life. That evening, when Linda came home at her usual time, I was waiting in the living room again. But this time, I had questions I was actually going to ask. "How was work today?" I said, studying her face. "Busy," she replied, giving me the same tired smile she'd been giving me for years. "We had a code blue in room 314 that lasted almost an hour. Poor man didn't make it." Another lie, delivered with the same casual confidence as thousands of others. "Linda," I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." Something in my tone must have alerted her because her expression changed. became more guarded. "What's wrong, Tom? Where do you really work?" The question hung in the air between us like a bomb waiting to explode. Linda's face went through a series of micro-expressions: confusion, calculation, fear, resignation, before settling into something I'd never seen before. The look of someone who'd been caught. "What do you mean?" she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I went to Mercy General yesterday to surprise you for our anniversary. They've never heard of you, Linda. You don't work there. You never worked there." Linda sat down heavily in the chair across from me, and for the first time in 18 years of marriage, I saw my wife without her mask. "Tom," she said quietly, "it's complicated, then uncomplicate it. Where have you been going every day for the past 8 years? Who are those children who call you Mama? Whose house were you at this morning?" Linda's face went white. "You followed me. I followed my wife to find out where my wife actually goes when she tells me she's going to work. What I found was a woman I don't recognize living a life I didn't know existed. What followed was the longest, most devastating conversation of my life. Over the next 4 hours, Linda told me about David Chen, a successful businessman she'd met at a medical conference 9 years ago. She told me about falling in love with him while still being married to me. She told me about Matthew and Emma, the children they'd had together, who believed Linda was David's wife and their full-time mother. "I never meant for it to happen," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But David and I, we connected in a way I'd never experienced before. He was sophisticated, worldly, successful. He made me feel like someone I'd always wanted to be. So, you decided to be 2 different people. I tried to choose, Tom. I really did. But I couldn't bear the thought of hurting you and the kids by leaving. And I couldn't bear the thought of losing David either. So I found a way to have both. By lying to everyone. David doesn't know about you," Linda admitted. "He thinks I'm divorced, that I have some kind of shared custody arrangement that requires me to be away a few days a week. And you thought I was working at the hospital." I stared at my wife, this stranger who looked like my wife, and tried to comprehend the scope of her deception. "For 8 years, Linda. 8 years of lies. 8 years of me raising our children alone half the time while you were playing house with another man. 8 years of me being proud of your dedication to your nursing career while you were actually being a mother to children I didn't know existed. I love you, Tom," she said desperately. "I love our children. I love the life we built together. But you also love him, and them." "Yes," she whispered. "Which family is real, Linda? Which life is the one you actually want?" "Both," she said. And I realized that was the most honest thing she'd said to me in years. I need both. I love both. I can't choose. But the choice was about to be made for her. Because Jake and Sophie walked through the front door at that moment, home from school, and overheard enough of our conversation to know their world was about to fall apart. "Dad," Sophie said, looking between Linda and me with confusion. "What are the children? What's Mum talking about?" I looked at my 13-year-old daughter, at my 16-year-old son standing behind her, and realized that Linda's elaborate deception was about to destroy not just our marriage, but our children's understanding of who their mother was. "Kids," I said, "sit down. There are some things about your mum that we need to discuss." What followed was the most difficult conversation I'd ever had as a father. I had to explain to Jake and Sophie that their mother had been living 2 separate lives, that she had other children with another man, that every time she'd missed their school events or family dinners, she hadn't been saving lives at the hospital. She'd been living a completely different life with a completely different family. Jake's reaction was anger. "So when you missed my state championship game because you had to work late, you were actually at some other kid's baseball game?" Sophie's reaction was heartbreak. "Do you love them more than us? Is that why you're never here?" Linda tried to explain, tried to make them understand that she loved everyone equally, that she'd been trying to protect everyone by keeping the family separate. But how do you explain to children that their mother has been systematically lying to them for most of their lives? The next few weeks were a nightmare. Linda moved out temporarily, staying in a hotel while we tried to figure out how to handle the situation. I hired a lawyer and filed for divorce, but the legal complications were staggering. Linda had been using our joint bank accounts to support David's family, had taken out credit cards in our name to pay for expenses I knew nothing about, had essentially been embezzling from our marriage to fund her double life. But the worst part was telling our extended family, our friends, our neighbors. How do you explain that your wife of 18 years has been living a secret life with another family? How do you tell people that the woman they thought they knew, the dedicated nurse, the loving mother, the faithful wife, was actually an elaborate fiction? The breaking point came when David Chen showed up at my house. I was in my garage, working on my truck and trying to distract myself from the wreckage of my marriage, when a BMW pulled into my driveway. A well-dressed Asian man in his 50s got out, and I knew immediately who he was. "You must be Tom," he said, extending his hand. "I'm David Chen. I think we need to talk." David looked exactly like what I'd expected. Successful, confident, the kind of man who belonged in expensive suits and drove luxury cars. Everything I wasn't. "She told you about me," I said. "Yesterday," he replied. "After 8 years of thinking Linda was divorced, I found out she's been married to you this entire time." We sat on my back porch, two men whose lives had been shattered by the same woman, and compared notes. David had been as deceived as I was. He'd believed Linda's story about her ex-husband and custody arrangements that required her to be away several days a week. He'd supported her financially, emotionally, and practically, believing she was a single mother struggling to balance work and children. "Matthew asks about you sometimes," David said. "About his mum's other job, why she has to go away so much. I always told him it was complicated adult stuff, that mum was working hard to take care of our family. Jake and Sophie are asking why their mum was never here for their childhood," I replied. "They're wondering if the woman who tucked them in at night and made them breakfast in the morning was the same woman who was tucking your kids in on the other side of town." We talked for hours, sharing stories about Linda, comparing the different versions of her we'd each known. With me, she was the practical, hard-working wife of a blue-collar veteran. With David, she was the sophisticated partner of a successful entrepreneur. Both versions were real, both were authentic, but neither was complete. "What do we do now?" David asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "How do you divorce someone who was never fully married to you in the first place? How do you co-parent with someone who's also co-parenting with someone else?" The situation became even more complicated when Child Protective Services got involved. Someone, I never found out who, reported Linda's situation to the authorities, and suddenly there were social workers investigating whether her ability to maintain 2 separate families constituted some form of child endangerment. Matthew and Emma were placed in temporary foster care, while the courts tried to determine the best living situation for children whose mother had been living a double life. Jake and Sophie remained with me, but they were required to attend counselling to deal with the trauma of discovering their mother's deception. Linda, meanwhile, was falling apart. Without the elaborate structure she'd built to maintain her 2 lives, she couldn't function. She'd lost her job, her real job, which turned out to be at a private medical clinic where she'd been working part-time for years, because her emotional state made her unreliable. She was facing potential criminal charges for financial fraud, and she was about to lose custody of all 4 children she'd been mothering. "I just wanted everyone to be happy," she told me during one of our last conversations before the divorce was finalized. "I thought if I could be what each family needed, everyone would have what they deserved." "But you weren't giving anyone what they needed," I replied. "You were giving everyone a lie." Jake and Sophie needed a mother who was present, who showed up for their lives, who didn't disappear for days at a time with mysterious explanations. Matthew and Emma needed a mother who was honest about her situation, who didn't force them to live with questions they were too young to understand. "And what did you need?" she asked. "I needed a wife," I said. "Not half of one." Pete, the divorce took 18 months to finalize, partly because of the complexity of Linda's financial deception, and partly because the custody arrangements were unprecedented. The courts had to figure out how to handle visitation rights for a mother who had been maintaining 2 separate families, how to ensure the emotional well-being of 4 children who had suddenly discovered they had half-siblings they'd never known about, and how to prevent further psychological damage to everyone involved. In the end, Linda lost primary custody of all 4 children. Matthew and Emma went to live with David, who hired a full-time nanny to help with their care. Jake and Sophie stayed with me, which is what they wanted. Linda was granted supervised visitation with all 4 children, but separately. The courts decided that combining the families would be too traumatic for the children, at least initially. The financial settlement was devastating for everyone. Linda had been supporting 2 households with money she'd obtained through deception, loans she'd taken without disclosure, and credit she'd extended using false information. David and I were both left with significant debt, and Linda declared bankruptcy. But the emotional damage was worse than the financial damage. Jake struggled with trust issues. If his mother could lie about something as fundamental as where she went every day, what else in his life might be false? Sophie developed anxiety disorders that required years of therapy. Matthew and Emma, who were younger, adapted more quickly, but still asked painful questions about why their mama had to leave them to take care of other children. 2 years after Linda's double life was exposed, I'm still trying to rebuild a normal existence for my family. Jake is a senior in high school now, focused on getting into college and leaving behind the chaos of his mother's choices. Sophie is doing better, though she still struggles with abandonment issues. We've both learned to live with the reality that the woman who was supposed to be the anchor of our family was actually the person who created the most instability in our lives. Linda lives alone now, in a small apartment across town, working as a part-time home health aide. She sees each set of children twice a month, always with supervision, always with the knowledge that her choices destroyed 2 families and traumatized 4 children. David and I have developed an unexpected friendship born from shared experience. We understand each other in a way that no one else can. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't decided to surprise Linda at the hospital that day. How long could she have maintained her elaborate deception? Would she have kept living 2 lives until the children grew up and moved away? Would she have eventually chosen one family over the other? Or would she have continued the charade indefinitely? But mostly I wonder how I lived with someone for 18 years without recognizing that she was fundamentally capable of sustaining such an elaborate lie. Were there signs I missed? Warning signals I ignored? Was I willfully blind to evidence that my wife was living a secret life? Or was she simply that skilled at compartmentalization and deception? The truth is that Linda wasn't a villain in the traditional sense. She wasn't cruel or malicious or deliberately destructive. She was a woman who wanted 2 different versions of herself to coexist, who believed she could give 4 children and 2 men what they needed without anyone getting hurt. She was wrong, but her intentions weren't evil. They were selfish, but not evil. The hardest part of recovery has been explaining to Jake and Sophie that their mother's capacity for deception doesn't reflect their worth as children. That her choice to maintain a secret family wasn't a rejection of them personally, but rather a manifestation of her own psychological inability to make difficult choices and accept consequences. "Do you think she really loved us?" Sophie asked me recently. "Or were we just another role she was playing?" "I think she loved the version of herself she was when she was with us," I told her. "But love that requires you to lie to the people you love isn't really love. It's performance." If you're watching this story, I want you to understand something important. The people we trust the most have the greatest power to deceive us because we don't question their basic honesty about fundamental things. I never investigated Linda's work situation because I had no reason to doubt that she was a nurse, that she worked at the hospital she said she worked at, that her absences were related to her professional responsibilities. Trust in a relationship isn't just about fidelity or honesty about small things. It's about trusting that the person you're building a life with is actually building that same life with you, not maintaining your relationship as one component of a larger structure you don't know about. Hit that subscribe button if you believe that authentic relationships require complete honesty, and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I hope my story helps you understand the difference between a life built on trust and a life built on carefully managed deceptions. Sometimes the person you think you know best is the person you don't know at all. And sometimes the life you think you're living is just one chapter in someone else's much more complicated story. The woman I thought was my wife was real, but she was only half of who she actually was. The question that haunts me isn't whether Linda loved me. I know she did. The question is whether she was capable of loving anyone completely when she was always holding back half of herself for someone else.